Okay, well, I predict that we will need the whole hour to learn from our excellent speakers today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the March 2023 RIEEE webinar. We are very excited for today's topic. The title of today's webinar is the CDIAC at AppState dataset on CO2 emissions, 39 years and counting. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. I want to let you know, welcome to the RIEEE team and all of our attendees. We do record these, so it's being recorded right now, and part of that is because people are busy, so sometimes we get a lot more watchbacks than we do live attendees. But this programming will go for 1 hour, and then we are lucky that our speakers can hang on for an extra half hour to dig deeper into some Q&A. So we might have some Q&A during the hour of recorded content, but then we'll have informal discussions for a half hour after. This is the second of 4 sessions in our spring webinar series. So the March 31st webinar, which will be at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, is on sensor-enabled research and environmental topics at AppState. And April 28th webinar is exploring our research and innovation collaboration on alternative proteins, so sustainable alternatives to meat. All right, so I'm going to jump right into our the introductions to today's speakers. Today, 2 presenters are going to present the history that I mentioned about the origin, evolution, and bright future of the CDIAC dataset, how it came to be at AppState. And our speakers are 2 wonderful folks. First, we have Dr. Gregg Marland, a research professor with a joint appointment in geological and environmental sciences and RIEEE. Gregg began work in climate change science in 1975, working with Ralph Roddy and Alvin Weinberg at the Institute for Energy Analysis at Oak Ridge Associated Universities, or ORAL. Since then, he's been involved in climate science and climate policy at every level, from local to international. It is doubtful that he even knows how many papers he has published in the field, but he has been lead author for IPCC reports, represented the United States at major conferences and policy meetings over the years. He's testified in congressional meetings, and he continues to ride his bike to campus when he's not busy tearing it up on the cyclocross racing circuit. So you will be enjoying hearing from Dr. Gregg Marland over the next hour. You will also hear from Matt Hefner, who is RIEEE's own environmental data scientist, much to the delight of many across our campus. And we're very lucky to have him here at RIEEE. Matt earned his master's in mathematics here at AppState, and he stayed on to lecture in the Department of Math for several semesters before joining the RIEEE team. He's in the midst of an annual update of the CDIAC dataset and beginning to work with data-intensive researchers all across campus that are connected with RIEEE. When he's not coding or perfecting data workflows, you might find him strumming his guitar. So come by Peacock Hall sometimes. With that, I'm happy to hand it over. We are in great hands, and I'm excited to learn from you both.
I think am I live?
You are.
Okay. This is a discussion of CDIAC at AppState, as Christine said. It's a interesting data set, and I think it's worth a little bit of discussion. So we're going to tell you today some history, some context, and something actually about the data set. My promise is that most of the stories I tell you are true. So we'll see where that takes us. I'm not going to show any slides. I'm just going to sit here and chat for a little while. But the CDIAC data set is a large data set on CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. It is online at the Appalachian Energy Center, as most of you certainly know by now. You had the link in the correspondence from Grace. And it's, it's the kind of thing that immediate question, it appears to me, is why is it at Appalachian. It has just a little bit more introduction. It has data on CO2 emissions by country, by year, by major fuel group, and it goes back to 1751. And I'll tell you, it's fun to be involved in it because it is widely used everywhere. And sometimes it's hidden away now in a secondary reference, but it's still widely used. I saw a reference to it in the New York Times on Tuesday, so it gets picked up in lots of places. But it's an interesting story, and I'm going to present mostly some history, and then Matt's going to tell you a little bit about the data set. The data, well, I'll give you the origin here. I'm going to read just a little bit, but I think most people are familiar with Charles David Keeling. Keeling he figured out a way to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with sufficient accuracy to be useful. And he established his observatory on top of Mauna Loa Observatory and has data back to 1958. And the data set is a famous data set, and David is famous as a result of it. But after starting the data set in 1958, he realized that if he wanted to do the things with it, he needed to know how much carbon dioxide was being put into the atmosphere. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit from his 1973 paper. So in 1973, he had 15 years of data from Mauna Loa, and he wrote, "The combustion of fossil fuels by world industry is causing an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Of special interest is to know what fraction of the industrial input is remaining airborne. And an essential ingredient in determining this fraction is to know accurately the amount of CO2 produced from fossil fuels." And he set off and did that. The intriguing thing on this paper is the acknowledgements. His acknowledgement in the middle of it, he says, "I am especially indebted to Dr. Ralph Amrati for suggesting improvements relating to almost every aspect of this paper, and for having taken the unusual trouble of checking all of the source data and all of the calculations." What he doesn't say is that Ralph got into this as an anonymous peer reviewer, and he was sent the article by TELUS to review, and he did indeed redo everything. The result of that basically is that Keeling said to Roddy, "Hey, you guys do that. I'm going to keep tearing the atmosphere. You keep track of what's going up." And that was in 1973. In 1975, Ralph Roddy joined a newly formed organization called the Institute for Energy Analysis. And in 1975, I joined a newly created organization called the Institute for Energy Analysis. So we started working together. And the Institute for Energy Analysis was an intriguing place. Let me keep myself organized here. It had been created by Alvin Weinberg. And let me read a little bit. This is a newspaper column, but a lot of these people have to write biographies, and Alvin did. So this is a newspaper article about Alvin Weinberg. He was, by this time, retired as director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And so he writes, "In summarizing the accomplishments of the Institute for Energy Analysis, which existed from 1975 to 1990, that Alvin founded and led at Oak Ridge Associated Universities," Weinberg wrote, "Our tiny group sparked the government's first serious effort to deal with global warming, and we were the first try to address the social impacts of carbon dioxide." Weinberg, it says here, was delighted when Ralph Roddy, a mechanical engineer and meteorologist, joined the IEA. Weinberg wrote in his book, "Since nuclear power plants once built emitted no carbon dioxide, could not the carbon dioxide buildup become a new powerful justification for reviving nuclear energy?" So he went from office to office in Washington, D.C., arguing that the government must, quote, "pay attention to carbon dioxide and preserve the nuclear option." Robert Siemens, head of the Energy Research and Development Administration, the predecessor of the Department of Energy, responded to Weinberg's pleas and established within IRDA a carbon dioxide effects office. And this is again another quote from Alvin, from 1976 to 1984, the Institute for Energy Analysis became the nation's center for matters connected with carbon dioxide. So both Roddy and I were part of this Institute for Energy Analysis. The leader of Institute for Energy Analysis was a nuclear advocate. He had been involved since the Chicago pile and was interested in promoting nuclear energy. And he believed that the problems of global change were going to make fossil fuels untenable. And what he needed to do was to fix the problems with nuclear energy. That didn't make him totally popular everywhere, but he was a strong advocate. And I just hold this up. This is a picture of David Keeling. I find a lot of analogies between David's problems with measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and our problems calculating the CO2 emissions. Keeling was always looking for money. He was always trying to figure out. I never talked to the man when he didn't ask, do you know any place I can get money? Do you know any way to support my work? And the answer was that he succeeded in keeping it funded. Of course, he was running a laboratory and had people working in the observatory at Mauna Loa. But he succeeded in keeping it going. The first big meeting, incidentally, in the US on global climate change, the big interdisciplinary meeting, was in 1977. And it was organized by Alvin Weinberg, Ralph Roddy, and myself. And it came out with a nice summary published, interestingly, by the US Department of Energy. The US Department of Energy did not exist when the meeting was held, but it was created within a year and published the proceedings from the meeting, which was kind of neat. Well, this is report number 001 on climate change out of the Department of Energy. So basically, with an endorsement from David Keeling, Ralph and I were together, and as you read there, he was a mechanical engineer and meteorologist, and we started calculating CO2 emissions. We started by getting a memorandum of understanding with the UN Statistics Office. The UN Statistics Office had started collecting energy data for the world in 1950 and had a rather comprehensive compilation of all sorts of energy data, how much is produced and so forth of all the different fuels. So we established a working memorandum with them. Initially, they had data only from 1950, and Keeling's interest, he didn't care how much came from where. All he wanted to know was the global total of emissions. So we started doing that. The data that we got initially from the UN came on a reel-to-reel magnetic tapes. The first product that we put out of there, in which we had country data assembled, looked like this. And we promised that it was available on magnetic tapes as well, but this was the product of CO2 emissions by country by year back to 1950. Data for gaseous fuels, liquid fuels, solid fuels, and cement. It was not a big seller. I'll just add that the International Energy Agency was created in 1974 after the 1973-74 oil crisis, and the IEA was created to try to prepare a common response to oil disruptions, and started collecting international energy data as well. So for quite a while, the International Energy Agency was collecting energy data from all its member countries, and the UN was collecting energy data from all else. It was chaos, as you might guess, trying to keep data, but we persuaded the two of them to get together, and in 2011, the two started cooperating under something called International Recommendations for Energy Statistics, and the system of energy data then became a little more comprehensive. So we had, I should, 1984 was the first publication that came out from us. It had energy data from 1950 to 1982, but mostly it established the procedure for calculating CO2 emissions, and we produced, and it said you take how much is produced. This is by country. How much is produced? How much is imported? How much is exported? What are your change in stocks? Do you have more standing in coal piles than you did at the beginning of the year? And from that, you have to know the fuel chemistry, and you have to know a little bit about how fuel is used, because you produce asphalt, which does not get oxidized to carbon dioxide the same year. So we had to have some idea of the sequence. So the reference approach then for calculating CO2 emissions is, as described in our 1984 paper by Marland and Roddy, really is the foundation that everyone uses everywhere who's calculating CO2 emissions. It comes off of that, and people will calculate different coefficients, but basically it goes to the prime source. We also wanted to know how much was produced from industrial processes, and the biggest industrial process is cement manufacture. So the U.S. Bureau of Mines was collecting data globally on cement manufacture. The U.S. Bureau of Mines was closed forever in 1996. So that data set was lost for a couple of years, and the U.S. Geological Survey revived it 2 years later. So we do have continuous data from U.S. Bureau of Mines, quote, to the U.S. Geological Survey. I don't know how much time I'm using here, too much. The data set is everywhere. It's kind of interesting to see it. As I said, it's embedded in another larger data set now. But I was intrigued. One year I got a message from a young man who said, "How come the CDIAC data is wrong?" And I wrote him back. I said, "How do you know it's wrong? Where did you get the right data?" So he gave me his reference of where he'd gotten the right data, and I compared the two and found out what he had done. He had our data from 1 year earlier. He'd missed the 1 year revision, but it was the same data that he'd gotten from some other source. The data was managed initially by the Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Center, which is what the CDIAC is. CDIAC was created in 1982 at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I was working again at this Institute for Energy Analysis, was in Oak Ridge, so we were just down the street, and they were managing all kinds of data on carbon dioxide, everything you can imagine, how much carbon is dissolved in the ocean, that sort of thing. And they ended up having trouble, although they were managing these huge variety of data sets. And the Department of Energy was asking, why should we be managing data on carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean? So they terminated the Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Center in 2017. And most of the functions of the data center were distributed somewhere in the NOAA system, EPA system. Most of the data went to a place called ESS-DI, which is at Berkeley National Lab. But the one piece that was not picked up anywhere was the CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. And we wanted to see it continue. I have one side story I forgot I was going to show. The original data set was based on UN data, which went back to 1950. We decided along the way that we needed to go back further in time to produce the data set. And we found this nice little book on world energy production. It was produced in Europe. Two scientists from Geneva and two from Paris. And when we found this book out, this book goes back to 1800. And if you read the footnotes carefully, it helps to connect the data back further than that. And so I called the first author and I said, this is just tables and tables and tables of energy data from all countries. I said, surely this data is available electronically. How can we get it? And he said, call author number 2. So I called author number 2, and author number 2 said, call author number 3. So I called author number 3, and it turns out these 4 guys had put together this book, and then they had a falling out. They wouldn't speak to each other. They didn't work with each other. And one of them had the magnetic tapes with all the data on it, but he wasn't giving it to anybody. So I called a friend of mine in Paris, and I said, will you take this guy out to lunch one day, buy him a drink, and see if you can count him out of the data set. We ended up hiring a graduate student who re-entered all the data in this book, and with some constructive comments, we got it back, the data set, to 1751. I've been getting correspondence this week from a data center that is trying to put together some of the data, and they wanted a full data sequence for Vietnam. You can imagine what the data sequence for Vietnam must look like, and particularly when the UN picks it up in 1950, and basically we can reconstructing the pre-1950 from this book. So there are data sequences for all countries, all years, but some of them are a little creative. The major thing happening right now is there's something called the Global Carbon Project. The Global Carbon Project is an effort to draw together all of the pieces on the global carbon cycle. It is, the U.S. is a member contributor. Some of you may know Rob Jackson used to be at Duke, but it's centered out of Australia. And they take our data set every year and blend it in with other data sets on other aspects of the carbon cycle, including the atmospheric concentration, and produce an annual report. And somehow they've created a system where their annual report is released just prior or during the international negotiations. It came out this year, the week of COP27, and so it gets into the system, it gets widely quoted, it goes through the press. And when I said earlier that it was a New York Times article on CO2 emissions, they attributed it all to the Global Carbon Project, but the core of the Global Carbon Project is in fact the CDIAC data. Anyhow, CDIAC at Oak Ridge National Laboratory was closed in 2017. 2 years later, Dean Spate and the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Appalachian State University said, we'll buy you a postdoc for a couple of years and see if you can get this data set up and running and find long-term funding to keep it going. So some of you have met Dennis Gilfland. Dennis was here and produced 2 years of updates to the data sequence, and he moved on. We now have a guy named Matt Hefner who has done the next year and is working on the next one. And intriguingly, right now, the money that we have to run this is coming from the Japanese Space Agency. Ultimately, the hope was we had funding for part of the transition when I first came to Appalachian. We had some NASA money. NASA. And somebody ought to be able to pay for this long term, but right now it's the Japanese Space Agency and Matt Hefner. And I think that I have done what I wanted to do. I just throw in this data started out fossil fuels emissions from 1950 on. Somewhere along the way, we produced a 1x1 latitude longitude grid. Somewhere along the way, we created a huge mess to get a monthly data set for the global. We had a state data for the US. We created a data set on the carbon isotopes for the people who were working with that. And it's lots of potential to go to lots of directions, but let me turn it over to Matt to tell you about the details and what he's doing with it now.
Well, hello. So I'm going to talk about the data set itself and how it's produced and a little bit about its future. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides. Can everyone hear me okay?
Very well.
Cool. So let me pull this up. And this over here. I have a case of too many screens. Okay, so let's start with just getting a little bit more detailed about the data set itself and what it contains. So when you go to the CDIAC website, under the Data Products tab, you will find 4 different Excel documents. 2 of those Excel documents are just sort of rankings of the other 2. The 2 main data products that CDIAC produces is a global product and a national product. For the global product, we track megatons of carbon for years 1751 to, in the case of the most recent product, 2019, we track megatons of carbon from natural gas that is flared, from cement manufacture, from gas fossil fuels, liquid fossil fuels, and solid fossil fuels. So that's globally. And we see that here in this plot. Now, this plot's actually truncated at, I believe, 1880. And that's just for size and scale and everything. It's mostly solid before 1880, and it stays pretty low. So there's also the national product. So the national product gives us all the same information except for in kilotons of carbon and for each country going back to 1751, when that country existed, of course. In addition to flaring cement, gas, liquid, and solid, the global product includes a per capita carbon emissions. We get the population data from the World Population Project. And the national product includes that. And the national product also includes emissions from bunkered fuels. That's for international trade and commerce. When you put oil onto a cargo ship to fuel it, we consider that marine bunkered, and there's also aviation bunkered fuels. So that's included in the national product. So those are the products themselves, the global and the national. So how do we actually calculate those carbon values? Well, as Gregg said, each year we get data from the UNESD, from the UN, that's the United Nations Energy Statistics Database. And we get data from the United States Geological Service, or Survey, USGS. And we get data from a couple other places like National Inventory Reports. Anyways, we get data once a year. And for each product year, each year that we create a data product, you can further divide that data into emissions years. So the actual year that emissions occurred. And there's a lag between the most recent emissions year available to us to do calculations and the product year, because it takes a few years for the UN to get that data. So when we zoom into an emissions year, we have countries for that year. And for each country, we have flows of an energy product. So here we have exports of brown coal, import of oil shale, production of kerosene type jet fuel. And so there's an associated quantity in appropriate units, of course, for a country, for a year, and for a certain flow for a certain product. So that's what these are. When we talk about a record in the UNESD, we're referring to this. An example of a record would be 839,000 kilotons of brown coal exported from China in 2019. So that is the energy flow represented in the UNESD. To get the carbon from that, we need 3 things, generally speaking. We need a carbon conversion factor, we need an assumed proportion of product oxidized, and we need an apparent consumption of that product. We find 6 different carbon calculations in the national product. And you will find these in global, except global doesn't have bunkered. We have the solid, liquid, gas, flared, bunkered, and cement. Cement does not use UNESD data, so we'll set that aside for a second. But for these other 5, we need to get the amount of apparently consumed product, multiply that by the proportion of that product we assume gets oxidized, and multiply that by a carbon conversion factor. To get the apparent consumption for solid, liquid, and gas fuels, we use these flows. So this is apparent consumption. We take the production and the imports of a product, and we subtract the exports, non-energy use, and the stock changes of that product. That's the apparent consumption. For flared fuels and bunkered fuels, that apparent consumption is actually directly given to us as a flow of an energy product in the UNESD. For cement manufacture, it all comes down to getting clinker. And there's two different ways that we can get clinker and then thus carbon. The first is to take data from the USGS in tons of cement manufactured and multiply that by a clinker ratio that we get from the Get the Numbers Right project. The second method we can use is, if they report it, go to the country's national inventory reports and get the clinker directly from that. So this is the general model for how to calculate the reference approach carbon emissions. It relies on these broad, large energy flows, these productions, imports, exports, etc. Now we'll say when we receive this data, it's no longer on reel to reel. So there's that benefit as well. Okay, so let's talk about how it was produced. So it was initially produced in SAS. The code to do this was implemented in a language called SAS. And for its time and purpose, the code was well written and it's remarkably well documented. There's obvious attention to detail and care. Here's an example of a program file in this code. So you can see that this designates an exception in CDIAC. And down here, this 416, 1991, and an amount, that's a country, a year, and an amount for a certain flow. In this case, it's Kuwait, and it has to do with flaring. The problems with this implementation, though, become apparent once you start looking a little bit closer at this. They break down into two broad categories. The first is sort of design, and the second is technological, though some of the design issues are resultant of the technological limitations. So the workflow of the SAS code, it's made difficult and time-consuming and error-prone by the need to run over 100 of these program files individually. And there's absolute path references and hard-coded variables to be changed and double-checked in nearly every product or program file. So there's hundreds of these that you'd have to go into every product year and hand change, type, variables, and file paths every product year. So that makes it error prone and time consuming, but also the solution was non-scalable and it really limited what could be done routinely in a timely manner. So the approach was to look at, to import the records for and calculate all the carbon calculations for each a carbon counting, so solid, liquid, gas, one at a time, instead of just loading all the records in and doing all the calculations and sorting later. And the other limitations, like I said, are technological. So the SAS software system that the code is implemented in, I'm going to say a hot take, it's very old statistical software. Its core utility at this point is being backwards compatible with legacy enterprise systems. So, you know, what's not a hot take is that, one, it's notoriously difficult to use and learn. And two, what's at issue, which is that the computational standards, data structures, and procedures in SAS are outdated or antiquated. At times, they're incompatible with most modern statistical software implementations. So an example of this is SAS rounds away from 0. When we learned to round in school, we learned that if I have 3.5, that rounds to 4, and 4.5, that rounds to 5. We round that 0.5 away from 0. But computers actually don't do this. In 1985, the IEEE 754 standard for floating point arithmetic specified that computers use what's called bankers rounding, where they round to the nearest even number. So if I have 3.5, that rounds to 4. But I have 4.5, that also rounds to 4. And this is to prevent systemic biases upwards as calculations are rounded over multiple iterations of calculations. So SAS predates the IEEE 754 standard for floating point arithmetic. SAS, believe it began development in 1966 at NC State University. So it predates the standards, and it needs to be backwards compatible with code from 1966, SAS code. So that was interesting. Ran into some anomalies in analyzing the data as a result of that. But also, not for nothing, SAS is a proprietary language and it's cheap cheap. So in sort of the spirit of open science and the spirit of having a better system, we decided to implement this model in R for this most recent product year. So let's talk about how it's produced now. So R was chosen to implement the software framework for CDIAC for multiple reasons. It's a modern, free, open source research language with active support and development communities with broad usage. It's very likely that future research partners will either already be familiar with R or with Python, which shares many data science tools and paradigms. So the code procedurally loads in every product year's data. And I want to go back here real quick just to make sure I'm clear. When I talk about product years, I mean green here. So it loads every UNESD and USGS data set. It loads every data set, and by running one script, the code procedurally processes the carbon for every flow of fossil fuel energy product, every single one in all of the data sets, along with comprehensive quality assurance reports of that data, statistical analyses, and models on demand. It does this in about 2 minutes. So takeaways from that fact: one, progress in modern hardware is what has allowed the tools used in R to be developed and to be useful. So while speed is directly attributable to modern hardware, it's not simply a matter of running the SAS code faster. The tools, the data science tools that are implemented in R and Python, they would not have been possible on the hardware at the time that this code was implemented. Also, you know, this automation, it frees up time for us to think about the data and not the code. And that's one role of really good data science. By implementing thoughtful data science tools, we extend the range of questions we can explore. So an example of that in CDIAC is the sector-based approach. We now, thanks to this new implementation, have access to energy use product flows identified by economic sector. So we're able to use this framework to run and compare thousands of models of product flows to each other, and we use that information to inform our model selection for a sector-based approach. And let's have a look at that. So we have our sectors here. These are energy use of these sectors, with the exception, of course, of non-energy use. And you can see that as a different vector of attack, this black line here, this is from the reference approach. This is what's in the traditional CDIAC data product. And you can see that when you sum up the sectors, that we get very close to that black line, what was in the reference approach. So as a different vector of attack from a modeling perspective, a sector-based approach to emissions gives a sense of inventory uncertainty in the reference approach, which is a key objective question in greenhouse gas inventory research. So in addition to already incorporated energy, population, and associated emissions data, the software framework allows us to quickly import and incorporate other relevant data like GDP. The ultimate goal of these sorts of analyses is to highlight mechanisms on which one could act to reduce emissions. And CDIAC has, in one way or another, been empowering that objective for 39 years. So if you'd like to play around with CDIAC in the data product, let me show you how to access it. We've had this link shared. I will share it again. Actually, Grace, if you'd just like to do that. Thank you. And that's all I've got.
Thank you both.
Let me interject real quick here. I was sorting through my notes, and there are three things that I meant to say and did not. One is prompted by Matt's talk, because when we started working with the UN, they were basically doing no QA, QC on the data set. It was put it together and get it out of here. And we in Oak Ridge really did the first QA, QC for them. And we would actually make trips to New York to help them work out some data problems. So it's the kind of thing that really is very much avoidable with the kind of approach that, or easy discovery with the kind of things Matt's doing. The second thing I want to add is that, you know, Dave Keeling had trouble keeping sponsorship for his laboratory, and we've had some interesting up and downs to it. Some of the earliest work we did was sponsored by the Gas Research Institute. And there's been a lot of criticism lately about how the fossil fuel industry has lied about global change. My sense is that back in the 70s, the Gas Research Institute understood that gas emitted less CO2 per useful energy than other coal and oil. So they sponsored some of our early work. The third thing I just throw out very quickly, David Keeling, some of you may know, as a result of his work, and I always find this interesting parallels because we were sort of following along. But David Keeling won the President's National Medal of Science in 2002. That's kind of a big event. I didn't get invited to the White House award ceremony, but I was at the reception that followed it, and very cool for David. Sorry, that was just three thoughts that I had while Matt was talking.
And I would like to tack on to that too. You know, I've left out a lot of stuff just to make, you know, something sort of digestible. But when it comes to QA, like all of these things that the SaaS software did had to be done individually by hand. So it really also limited the QA and QC that could be done. Oftentimes all the QA QC that was done in the SAS code originally is all looking at the entries in the UNESD, and it does not convert them in the SAS code to look at the implications in carbon. So if I have a record that changes from one product year to another in the UNESD, it'll say, hey, this amount of kilotons of brown coal change. But it won't tell me the effect that had on the carbon. It might be minuscule. It might be really big. So that's one benefit of the R implementation anyway.
Well, thank you so much. And you both did a fantastic job really putting in perspective the sort of the historical leaps and bounds we've come, you know, both technologically and in our understanding of the data conceptually. I think anyone should feel free to jump in with a question. I will kick us off with a question just because I'm already talking. I'm curious if you gave us a really good appreciation of the uniqueness of the data set and particularly in its longevity. Who are people that should be using your data products as inputs and do not? You know, like I'm curious about the dissemination and the impact, the ripple effect of this knowledge that you all are gathering. Who is one of your customers that should be using your data as input that is not currently?
I think the data set is easily findable and is found. We get queries globally, basically. Whether it goes through the Global Carbon Project translation, which they do a little bit of tinkering, and that I should have said it was done in Oslo. There's a group in Oslo, but the Global Carbon Project paper came out last year with 70 some authors, including both Matt and I. So it gets aggregated and loses the direct connection. But the press finds it. I think anybody that Googles carbon dioxide emissions, they're gonna come to the AppState website.
Can I jump in with a question? That was very interesting, both of you. Is there either in the CDIAC data or elsewhere, or maybe in the future, people working on, I'm sure, to isolate emissions by point source, and so not just national, state, but this cement manufacturer in North Carolina, those granular level emissions.
Greg, you want to take that, or you want?
I was wondering if Dustin, would you like to say something about that, Dustin?
Oh, I can. That wasn't my intent, but to answer that question, the way I would answer that question had I been giving this presentation, there are several data sets as far as eGrid from the EPA that actually contains just point source information, and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which is, I think, also EPA, which contains cement manufacturer, not globally though, just for the US. So there are data sets out there that you can use to inject those point source emissions. One issue is that the locations of the power plants and cement manufacturing point sources don't always align with where they actually are, and particular emission years don't always line up. So it's one of those you got to do a lot of manual checking.
Thank you.
I see Shenghi Wu has a question in the chat. Were you about to say the same thing, Grace? And the question I can ask Shenghi, if you want to speak up, you're welcome to, or I can also just read it out. Would you provide data at the county level in the US? Is that possible?
We do have county level data for the US, but it did not come from this exercise. There's a fellow whose name is off my tongue right this minute, Northern Arizona University, puts a data set for the US.
EPA from Environmental Protection Agency.
What's his name, Dustin? Who am I talking?
Kevin Gurney?
Kevin Gurney has a data set. It's very, very fine. It's a 1 kilometer grid, and we've aggregated it up to the county level. That data set does exist. We're using it at Appalachian. Jeff Colby could probably tell you how to access it, and if he can't, some of his students can. Yes, but it's just US.
Yes.
But it's based on how many trucks are rolling down the highway and how many gas heated buildings are likely in the block.
Okay. Can you please advise whether the database access is free or need to pay for any fees?
It's free, and it's called Vulcan, VULCAN. So you can find it by Googling Vulcan CO2 emissions.
Thank you.
So I have a question. When I originally unmuted was not to answer Dave's question, but so my question is more for Matt. I have an easy question followed up by another easy question. Your product year is 2020, or what's your current product year that you're working on?
So we finished a couple of months ago the 2022 product year. The product year is the year we work on it.
And then your emission year that you've released is 2020?
So for 2022, the most recent emissions year is 2019. So
okay.
The most recent version of the database is 1751 to 2019.
Gotcha. So my follow-up question would have been, if you've either released it or you're starting to look at 2020 data at that national level, are you actually seeing any anomalies due to the COVID pandemic?
So we haven't yet received the 2020 numbers, but all indications are that there will be a significant decrease, temporary decrease in carbon emissions in 2020, largely due to transport. So that's one reason we were really eager to get the sectoral based analysis going, is so that we could look at exactly what sectors were hit by the pandemic.
Okay.
The sectoral data, I mean, Matt is still working on that. It's hot. It's not hot off the press. It's still on the press, but there's a lot of information that hasn't been available. We're looking very much forward to, like you, Dustin, to seeing the 2020.
I have a quick question kind of related to that. So there were articles during the pandemic about some emissions changes and lots of different things that people noticed. What data sets or scales were those sorts of analyses occurring at or with?
A lot of those analyses were based on very little bits of data. You know, you count bus traffic in Shanghai and extrapolate to the world. Yeah, was those kinds of things. Very little data, in a very few sectors. How much electricity was consumed in Kigali, and project that to the global. So I think the 2020 data is going to be fun.
I've got a related question to that, actually, is you know, part of what you described in the evolution was certainly about decreasing your uncertainties around a lot of these estimates. Is that representable in graph form? Can you query and kind of represent the relationship to uncertainty over the years of CDIAC's existence?
So to clarify your question, do you mean look at the multiple? One thing we do is look at multiple product years, and we compare the carbon calculations across the product years to look at, for a particular record, at a certain, you know, say gas for China in 2019. That's going to change over multiple product years ever so slightly. And we recently submitted a paper with Connor Briggs where we talk about those changes over the product years. Is that kind of what you mean?
I was more talking about just your source data uncertainty, and as you've had the ability to calibrate both your kind of mechanisms for estimating what the real emissions are and how to kind of delineate those over the different buckets that you're putting them into. You've increased your ability to narrow in your estimate in part because you have a larger set of source data and you have more confidence in your source data. So just thinking about I'm sitting right near 4 books on uncertainty, so that could be like a 6-hour fight at a risk analysis conference. But I was just curious if there's value to doing that, because the lower your uncertainty, the higher the decision-making confidence in whatever the estimate is that you're providing.
Mm-hmm. Greg, you've had some more experience with uncertainty, trying to calculate uncertainty for the CDIAC values. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to say the last time we tried to do that, we ended up with stating, I mean, the global sum, we estimated in the 6 to 10% plus or minus range. But if you want to know emissions from Vietnam in 1949, that could be off by 200%. You kind of construct those things, but matching us calculations, the there's a European center that's doing emissions calculations, and the match is very good, especially for the major countries. The biggest problems are historically, of course, but some of the developing countries just don't have the statistical systems. But the things like the global total or the emissions from major developing countries are actually pretty good, but it's hard to get a handle on it. The question that Senghui asked, that Vulcan data set, I've used it, or we've used it in a paper that we're working on, and the reviewers wanted to know the plus minus on it. And Gurney is very clear that, you know, he's doing it by sector, as Matt has done for the US, and the sectors, the unique uncertainty with each sector. So the uncertainty in a county depends on which of the mix of sectors, and Gurney simply declines to nominate a number for uncertainty.
We're uncertain about the uncertainty.
Yes.
Smart. Well, maybe I'll pass it to Grace. We are kind of at the point where Grace may have some closing announcements, and then everyone is welcome to stay, but we'll close the formal part of this and then we can have open discussion after. So anything you want to leave folks with, Grace?
Thanks, Christine. Just a quick reminder that we have 2 more in the series this spring. Christine mentioned those at the beginning, but for those who joined late, we're shaping up a sensor-enabled research at AppState, one for March 31st, and then we'll have another on the alternative proteins topic, April 28th. And I did just put our Google group in the chat. If you're not already joined, please do join it. Internal or external to the university. And the last thing I'll give here is this form is just a quick kind of feedback and to help us follow up effectively. If there's interest in follow-on conversation or any kind of programming around this topic, you can use that form to let us know. Thanks.
And thank you so much to Gregg and Matt for preparing that. That was it was wonderful to learn from you.